Yeah, I guess I kind of felt like I was, I picked up little bits and bobs of what you're doing. And I just kind of felt like I wanted to ask you some questions. Like I've been on your talk show, I think once or twice when you had it on Gaia. We've hung out personally, and I feel like you're like a, an intelligent, thoughtful guy. And I find that I don't really understand kind of where you're coming from. And I wanted to kind of understand it a bit more. So I thought I would just let me just start by asking you some questions. You can also ask me some questions. And then, maybe we'll have back and forth and dialogue. And even if we have, severe differences of opinion, we'll keep it friendly and respectful and non-attached in a way. But so first of all, I mean, somebody, when I mentioned that I was going to have you on for discussion, somebody noted that they said that you didn't really believe in anthropogenic climate change. So I thought I would start with that. Can you give me a sense of what your perspective is on that?
Sure. I think that what we're looking at as far as the climate change, there are many dissenters that, you can just, look at their arguments. I'm not a scientist. I simply study and hear different arguments. So when you look at, for example, in our solar system itself, including specifically Mars, you have warming going on other planets in the solar system. You have to consider that maybe what we're looking at is more of a global, more than a global phenomenon, but actually a solar system phenomenon, which connects perhaps to solar flares, which one of the arguments for what really impacts climate is solar flare activity. You have also to consider that even the charts that are shown of the carbon, sort of following heating. Actually, if you look at the graphs, they actually show that carbon follows the heating. It's not vice versa. It's not that carbon causes the warming. It's actually carbon is released in the process of the warming. So essentially what I'm getting at is I look at it as we are going through a climate change. It's not driven by humans, even actually the human impact when it comes to carbon emissions is such a small percentage globally that I look at it more as an issue of where we are on the galactic plane, solar radiation, solar flare.
Can I push back a little bit, Sean? I mean, my understanding, I studied this in depth when I wrote the book, How Soon Is Now, is that, yes, there are some, a small group of dissenting scientists, but the vast preponderance of scientists who study this in depth are completely convinced that anthropogenic climate change is happening. And we know that we're putting 1 million tons, something like that, of CO2 into the atmosphere every hour. We know that the atmosphere is like a narrow sheath, and we know that there's a level of CO2 in the atmosphere that's going up because of the industrial CO2 that we're putting in the air. So we know that we've that 350 parts per million was what allowed for us to have a stable climate for the last thousands of years. And we're now, I think, somewhere over 400 parts per million. And we know that the last time we had 400 parts per million, it was a very, very different climate. And yeah, I mean, certainly there's, solar system caused climate change, but I don't really think from anything I've seen, there's any actual hard evidence that in this case, what's happening in this situation over the last 100 years, which scientists have even known about for quite a long time, is that phenomenon. It seems pretty much there's a vast preponderance of scientific, understanding that we are, having a large scale impact on the Earth's climate system, and the Earth is getting warmer rapidly because of human activity.
Again, you're looking at consensus, so-called consensus science. When you really look at it, there's a lot of consensus science is based on the fact of who finances the scientists in their universities, how these systems are based to make money. If you look at the actual intention of the various treaties that are formed over the decades, going back to the Rio summits, and then thereafter the Paris Climate Accord is only the most recent one. Oftentimes it has to do with cartels, essentially major financial cartels trying to control the energy output of countries. And that's why they do the carbon swap deals, which is a way of making money and speculating on energy production in countries. So
Okay, can I just push back for another second?
Yeah, to me, there's no consensus. Just to say that there's no consensus when it comes to actual science. There's just an evolution of understanding of what you're actually looking at. And I don't.
I find that very unsupported, actually, to be honest, by the evidence. I mean, my understanding is that when you have the dissenting scientists, yes, there is money that's going in to create the illusion of scientific dissent, but the forces that are put behind that are the fossil fuel interests. And we know that corporations will fight tooth and nail to preserve and enhance their profit motive. We know that. I mean, I'm sure you agree that the cigarette companies tried for decades to make it questionable whether or not nicotine was causing cancer. There's a lot of situations like this. I mean, from what I understand, and there are movies about this and whistleblower reports and a massive preponderance of scientists, as I said, it seems that the corporations are the ones who've paid for, in many cases, the dissenting scientists in order to, because they know the way the media works, and if you can keep the kind of illusion of a balanced argument in the media, it slows down the mechanics of public opinion and therefore the legal changes that would have to happen. I mean, I honestly, do you agree that the oceans are absorbing excess CO2? I mean, according to the evidence that I've studied, the oceans are something like 30% more acidic over the last 40 years because they're absorbing a huge amount of industrial CO2, and that's actually leading to a disintegration of the world's coral reefs and so on. So I mean, do you think that that's happening, or you also think that that's just a theory, or there's dissenting evidence?
I think that there's just too many factors. I mean, again, I've studied this over the years. I'm not currently versed in terms of, I haven't been studying this recently. I've studied it over time, and I've just looked at the fact that there's many factors when it comes to everything from climate to pollution, acidification of oceans. There's a lot of different factors involved, and I just don't think that we understand these processes as well as the scientific community likes to, as far as what you're told, the scientific community likes to say feign that they understand, pretend that they understand more than they do. You're basically ultimately not studying a closed system here. The Earth is a not closed system, right?
So my question is, what would it take for you, because I think this is where we're at in the world right now, and it's kind of partially why I wanted to have a conversation with you. I mean, I think people get entrenched in all sorts of belief systems, and kind of a question, a certain one is, what would it take for somebody to reassess? Would you have to meet the scientists who do the work? Would you have to go to the labs? Because I mean, if it is the truth that anthropogenic climate change is happening and accelerating and warming is going off the charts and our industrial systems are causing it, then it's not something one would want to be on the wrong side of. You wouldn't want to be telling people that it's not a problem when it actually is something that might, make it impossible for your children to survive on the planet. So it is kind of important as somebody who has any following or sees themselves as a public figure in any sense to not be on the wrong side of this particular issue.
Actually, I disagree. I love Michael Schellenberger's new book, Apocalypse Never. The fear mongering has been going on for 30 plus years. Before the 80s, it was actually the idea of the coming ice age, which may still be a factor. We don't really know what's coming in terms of whether or not we're going to another mini ice age or greater, perhaps even a pole shift that could cause that. But the point is that this fear mongering is not a new thing. Okay, I've been hearing it since the 90s. We have 20 years, we have 30 years. I don't think that we have to fear monger about this. I really don't. I think that we can
notice the fires all around the world, like the giant forest fires in Australia and California, and the massive increase in storms, and all of this would mesh with the anthropogenic climate change hypothesis.
Not really.
We're seeing drying out in some areas. We're seeing droughts in some areas. We're seeing wetter climates in some areas. We're seeing because the CO2 is trapping more moisture in the atmosphere, and then that's leading to more superstorms, in some areas and so on. I mean, to me, it really does seem I can look at. There's always going to be dissenting views. So I guess that's part of what intrigues me about what you're putting out into the world is I don't understand how you're forming your kind of picture of reality.
My picture of reality.
Something like the possibility of human-made climate change. I mean, we look all around, we see factories, we see cars, and we know that a million tons of CO2 is going to the atmosphere every hour. We know that the atmosphere is a particular size, and that's actually, you know, increasing the amount of CO2, you know, in each cubit area of the atmosphere. So it was 350 parts per million, now it's over 400, and that's a scientific fact.
You're still talking about 4% of the actual overall output of CO2 on the planet. So that's not even a major factor. So I'm saying is, if you study history, none of this surprises me. You're taught people like, the problem is that consciousness has shifted to a place. This is actually what's interesting more is consciousness. See, consciousness, human consciousness 100 years ago had no conception of what happened in China if you were in America. You'd be lucky to get the news days, if not weeks later. Okay. Now we're in a place where consciousness is so global that whatever happens in one part of the world is instantaneously downloaded to you. So you're sitting here going, wow, there's these massive fires taking place in this part of the world. This is old stories. I mean, look, the Grand Canyon used to be underwater. There's natural processes occur on this planet. And what I think it's hubris of the human to sit there and go, well, we're just these small little ants on the planet and we're doing such destruction to the planet. The Earth is going to be fine. The only thing we have to really worry about, I agree with you, is ourselves, our own people. But I focus on pollutants. I don't focus on the carbon dioxide, which is the only natural so-called pollutant, but you know, it's a natural part of our oxygenation process, right, as humans. So, and all living things, by the way, partaking in it, photosynthesis, that would actually, the carbon dioxide would actually, we should be focusing on a greenification of the planet. If you know, if we're so concerned about carbon dioxide, that's what I would focus on, you know, bringing more green, planting more trees, bringing more greens to this planet. So I think the pollutants are a big issue, absolutely. And I think that toxins and pollutants we can focus on and actually quantify and refer to. But when it just comes to this overall,
why can we quantify? Why can we quantify
on that bandwagon? That's all.
Why can we quantify pollutants and we can't quantify something like CO2, which you know, as I said, the past ironclad reality.
You can't know the repercussion of the CO2 because I told you, you're not living in a fixed, enclosed, entropic process here. We're not a closed system, this planet. It's a very,
but I wonder also, I guess
there's a very dynamic process. Climate's a very dynamic process. That's why I say you can quantify CO2 output, but you actually are, if you look at the charts, so many things have been inverted and changed over time, manipulated to intentionally create a narrative. I'm telling you, if you look at the charts, the carbon dioxide follows the heating process. Just like if you heat a bottle of Coke, you're going to get carbon dioxide release. The heating precedes the carbon release.
But this, I mean, I don't have the, you know, like, you know, I mean, I've gone through these arguments when I looked at climate change, and I did start it in a skeptical and you know, balanced, open-minded perspective. But for me, when I read, you know, so many books and also just looked at what's happening in New York, I mean, in the 1930s, my mother could walk across the Hudson River sometimes in the winter. You know, in the 1970s, sometimes you know, we would be able to, you know, walk across the ponds in Central Park. You know, and it's just clear that a tremendous warming cycle is happening. You mentioned, you know, the Grand Canyon was once underwater. Yeah, but that was, you're looking at processes that took, you know, millions and millions of years. And it's clear now that these processes are happening, like enormous change is happening to our environment in decades. And actually, you know, basically every, you know, honest and integral scientist that I've seen, if they're looking at the Arctic, what's happening there, you know, they're terrified. And when they're seeing, you know, methane erupting from the Arctic, you know, that's, you know, 30 times more potent as a heat trapping gas than CO2. And it's all happening on a time scale, you know, way faster than was predicted decades ago.
You can't predict kind of scales. You can't predict how quickly, I mean, look how quickly the dinosaurs went extinct. You can't predict these kind of events and how quickly actually it takes, you know, you could say the whole process that we're living through now has taken thousands of years to get there. But more importantly, if you look at the warming process, it's not the end of the world. It would, even if the Earth did warm to the place that is being warned, you know, a couple of degrees, you're actually in the melting of the Arctic. Who's to tell you that you can actually then continue your crop production and your growing of agriculture into the northern climates, like what is now Canada and other places that are in the north might be too frigid currently, but if there was, say, an overall warming, we would adapt to it. We would actually be able to move into places, including the Arctic. There's an argument there was civilization in the Arctic. Let me just finish my point. There was civilization in Antarctica, and there's actually a hypothesis that I think is very valid that we will see with the warming process, we'll actually start to see relics and other artifacts of civilization in the Arctic itself. So we can't be stuck in this idea just because you're born in the 30s or 40s or 50s. That's the way life is. Human life as an adaptive evolutionary process is more than 200,000 years old, you know, if you're honest. And this is why we have to learn to be adaptive to it. And I agree, yes, take active action when it makes sense. But the overall agenda of climate change is to limit technological energy output from nations. Nations like America, nations in Africa, nations across the planet. This is very much the intention behind the global warming narrative, I guarantee you. And we can get into.
So let's move into that a little bit. But I totally disagree with you about what you said about the northern climates. I mean, yes, food growing will become more plausible in Russia and Siberia. Those areas will become better. But what's going to happen to India and Africa and South America, where you're already having mega droughts and weather that is so hot that people can't actually survive outside for more than a few hours? If the warming increases as it's done, you're going to have huge populations that are not able to survive on large parts of the world, and that's going to create tremendous suffering and tremendous destabilization. But I'm kind of curious. So, like, when you look at a subject like climate change, or other subjects that interest you, how do you establish what's true for you?
Just read a lot. I mean, I guess I've looked at this since the 90s. I did the environmental studies classes, so I took the more traditional, as you say, the consensus science approach, and then I started looking at the alternatives, and the alternatives made a lot more sense to me.
But they don't make more sense to me, and what you've expressed so far, you certainly don't make any more sense to me whatsoever, because the evidence is so clear on the part of so many deeply concerned and highly integral scientists that we are having this impact on the climate, that we have gone past 400 parts per million, that we're putting 1 million tons of CO2 in the atmosphere every hour. So to me, it feels like, from my perspective, when I hear you express yourself on it, there's like a willful distortion. And a sort of incapacity to actually, maybe think that just because there are conventional perspectives and science out there, that also doesn't mean that they're wrong. It doesn't mean that they have all the answers. And I'm interested in free energy. I think it's possible.
This is the beauty of it.
We might be able to, access energy from the quantum field or the structure of the vacuum. So some of those technologies have been, developed and suppressed. Like, I'm open to all sorts of alternatives, but that doesn't mean that I have to reject everything that's consensus and normative, particularly when I've read myself so many books and listened to so many talks, and really do feel that these people who are looking at this issue are deeply in integrity. So I guess what I'm trying to understand in this conversation, and I'm thrown by it in general right now, is, how do we establish consensus, coherence? I guess sense-making has become a very popular term. And, what are kind of like, what's like the rules of dialectical reasoning that are plausible for us now to begin to unify, worldviews? Because, like, for instance, I mean, in some of the stuff that I've seen of you, it seemed that there was a lot of sympathy to aspects of the Q-anon narrative, like this idea that Trump was somehow an agent who was resisting a kind of deep state, malevolence. And I'm also not a fan of the neoliberal Democrats, and believe that they're very complicit with Wall Street and other factors of society that are kind of ruling psychopathic in some ways, but that also wouldn't then lead me to think that Trump had anything positive to offer, when the best that I can understand from Trump, when I look at his background and the people he surrounds himself with, is that he's kind of the representative of a transnational mafia, like a gangster syndicate of oligarchs and plutocrats who also have a particularly negative agenda for the future of society. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on Trump and the deep state agenda.
Sure. Before getting there, I was just going to give a little reflection in terms of, you're saying, how do you come to, how do you organize your dialectic? And it's not as simple as saying, it's either or. I was watching a very interesting TED talk from a guy named Alan Savory the other day. Savory is a scientist who has done a lot of work with desertification in Africa. And he said, our assumption was always, just to close out on this climate change thing. He's like, our assumption as scientists was always that it was actually, we had to get rid of the wildlife to preserve the land, because it was the wildlife that was creating the desertification, right? So he's like, we massacred elephants on these natural, wildlife refuges in Africa, right? 40,000 elephants were massacred because they were supposedly causing the desertification, right? That was the scientific consensus idea. He said that proved wrong. And he said, when we actually were honestly looking at it, he's like, from my research, from actually empirically doing studies with this, actually food grazing of cattle was actually preserving the land and actually helping to regenerate the land. That was, nowadays is being argued like cattle are the ones causing the climate destruction. I'm sorry, causing the desertification that's leading to climate change and whatnot. So his whole thing was actually, if you organize your livestock and do it in a way that's in congruence with nature, you actually want to have cattle grazing the land, which again, many people will argue, well, it's the meat industry that's causing, that's damaging, that's creating desertification. It's not that simple, is my point. And so
I've studied Alan Savory's work in depth, and I wrote about him in How Soon Is Now.
Yeah.
The jury is still somewhat out on him. I know there was one film that was, in a way, vegan propaganda, but they made a strong case against his research. But I think it's fascinating. I mean, yeah, his idea is that the steppes, the steppe nomads in these kind of sparsely vegetated grasslands, the herds of livestock had a crucial function. Both their saliva masticating the plants, their poop, their carcasses. It actually replenished that scarce natural environment and kept it from desertifying. Exactly. So I think that's totally reasonable and probably the case, but that's totally different than the type of mass industrial animal agriculture that we're seeing around the world that we know is excruciatingly destructive. I mean, the reason that the Amazon is being deforested at an excruciating rate is to create soybean plantations for cattle, which has been the case for the South America and the U.S., but now also China is trying to get those massive concessions for livestock and so on. And we know that type of livestock is very, very destructive environmentally.
Well, it doesn't make sense for that type of land. So it's like, why would you cut down a rainforest, the tropical environment, right, and use it for cattle grazing? It just doesn't make sense. And so I'm someone that looks, again, holistically. What is actually, like, how do we work in conjunction holistically, as you say, with nature, but at the same time, how can we be honest with the situation and not being manipulated? As I think a lot of, as you say, Savory's work, there are those that are going to say that it's, that it's off. There's those that are that are intentionally, promoting vegan propaganda, or it's their worldview. I'm not extremist in any capacity. I'm simply looking for the holistic approach.
Savory is probably right that sparse hunter-gatherer groups or nomadic herders were benefiting the environment. But now we're feeding hundreds of millions of people with factory raised animals, and it's having so many negative effects, in terms of the antibiotics, in terms of the deforestation, in terms of the CO2 production, the water, the excessive amounts of water and grain that are required to produce protein from animal matter. It's just not a scalable system. But it is true that on a very small scale, animals are of great benefit for keeping land fertile. A very nice movie about that is I think it's called The Biggest Little Farm, about this couple from LA who were in the media. They got tired of the media, so they decided to create a small farm, and they took over what had been like an industrial farmland in Southern California. And you watch in 6 years as they apply regenerative farming techniques, and the whole land replenishes, and they have animals. I don't know if they have cows. They certainly have like chickens and pigs, maybe cows also. But everything comes back to life, and all the birds and butterflies and insects come back, and the soil rejuvenates. I think it's actually a very profound and important film. It took 6 years, then you see this huge difference. But anyway, yes. So let's let's think about the Trump and the deep state. So what's your perspective now on Trump and Trumpism?
So to understand, it actually connects to the environmental issue in a certain capacity. I think you got a chance to look at some of my book, New World Order, which is particular to the lineage of Henry Kissinger, his mentor at Harvard. But through the mentor and his worldview, we came to understand certain things about how the British Empire was seeking to preserve itself at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And at that time period, there was an understanding that the environmental movement would be a way to basically have international bodies have imposition and control over national sovereignty. So the idea of national sovereignty was anathema to the imperialist mentality. You see, the imperialist mentality was just because, you're an Arab and you happen to be on top of oil, in terms of that region, Arabia, let's say, that's just the coincidence of history. So you shouldn't have sovereignty over that oil, right?
Can I hold on for 1 second, Sean? Because I find that also a little bit confusing. My understanding is that the nations in the Middle East and Africa and South America were actually kind of designed and constructed by the imperialist and colonialist powers specifically to break up the tribal confederations, the tribal groups. So it ensured them access to the the minerals and material resources of those regions. Because then you could put a Western-style government, which was totally alien to these more like tribal societies, and be able to kind of manipulate those governments. So I don't. First of all, I don't even quite, from my perspective, national sovereignty isn't necessarily an ultimate good. I see that nations are another human construct, not even a very old one. I think before the revolutions of the late 18th century, there wasn't, there were kingdoms. So nations is a recent model for how to organize large scale human groups.
Pretty much.
I don't necessarily see it as something of great benefit, or even of something that is going to be of great use in the future. I think probably in the future, to survive in the face of a traumatic ecological crisis that we've created, we're going to go back to something like bioregionalism, where it's going to be like, people are going to be more connected to their local bioregions than to any idea of a national identity.
Okay, so that's perhaps where we disagree. But just to finish the point, yes, you're correct. The imperialists did create those nations, but again, it was an evolution, yes, of use of certain tribes and certain boundaries that were being constructed. But my point was simply that just because those Arabs, let's say, were on top of that land that had oil in it, the imperialists' argument was that the Arabs did not necessarily have sovereignty over that oil. Same likewise for any African country that was basically seen as as a vestige of imperialism, but ultimately not sovereign over their own land. So the imperialist mentality was simply, how do we get hold of this land, of these regions that basically we want to take hold of through international corporations and international control apparatuses, whether it be World Wildlife Fund, agreements and accords to essentially inhibit the sovereignty of any people over itself. And I think when talking about national sovereignty, it's difficult to talk about any other nation.
So for some reason, you see non-profits like the World Wildlife Fund as more pernicious than, let's say, multinational corporations and kind of, the military-industrial complex of America and Western Europe, which was used to, carve up, these other areas. I mean, I find that when you interpolate World Wildlife Fund into that conversation, I mean, my understanding is that imperialist powers, the empire of Western Europe, which then became the empire of America, constructed a system that was largely designed for their benefit, that gave them a large level of control over the economies of these other countries, and then post 1960s. It went from a military colonialism to a financial-based colonialism, where debt was used as a main instrument of servitude. So I'm living in Mexico right now, Mexico, twice was forced by the World Economic Forum in the United States to undergo structural adjustments, where they basically, they'd given them, a loan, they couldn't pay back the loan. Okay, we're gonna forgive some of the loan and restructure it, but in return, you're gonna have to privatize some of your industries. You're gonna have to make it more amenable for foreign investment and so on. And in both times, it knocked down the average quality of life for average Mexican people like 25%, while making it much more easy for foreigners and foreign companies to exploit the situation here.
Yeah, absolutely. That was especially strong in the 80s, that they had those. I think it was those plans to basically, destroy the Mexican economy. And I don't know how NAFTA ultimately did towards helping the Mexican economy. But my point is that I'm not disagreeing with you. World Wildlife Fund, you have to look at it in the context of the British Empire as an extension of it. These NGOs are also extensions of imperialist policies. Oftentimes, they would, you use it to access lands and to sequester lands in a sense, from development and from industries that you don't want. So you create certain monopolies, essentially.
I mean, I guess I would wonder, wouldn't that be a positive thing? Why are we in such a rush to despoil and exploit, every natural ecosystem and resource? And that we are basically annihilating the wilderness on the planet. I think it's like 50% less animals on the planet now than like 30 years ago or 50 years, I don't know exactly. Insects are down 80% over the last 30 years. Wouldn't efforts to protect wildlife and wild places and nature actually be of great value? And if you have a exploitative economic system that's designed so that corporations are able to extract what they want, then wouldn't you then need another type of organization like NGOs, which if anything don't have enough power to try to countermand or interrupt the process of destruction that have been unleashed by a very unfair economic system?
Again, this is where you and I would disagree. At one level, is it important to take inventory and awareness of the effects on the ecology? Absolutely. But when you actually are inhibiting the development of industry, see, I'm a pro-industrial person. See, I'm pro-industry because I see the standard of living that's been given to people in the United States and developed nations, and saying, I think we want to strive to raise the standard of living. And as we raise the standard of living, we raise the overall infrastructure and technologies associated, we become more conscious, more aware, and ultimately more protective of our environments as a result, as opposed to nations that are deindustrialized and actually are just, let's say, living at like the bottom end and actually doing more destruction and harm. So the problem is, you ultimately there's a constant dialectic, you want to call it, between at what level do you actually impact the the ecological community. And the United States, for example, is the United States is a great example of where EPA and other limitations are actually inhibiting certain development and growth. That's why I look at our country and see a lack of industrialization going forth. I don't see the infrastructure going forth. I don't see the development and the future of our country unless we start to re-industrialize, instead of what we've been doing is deindustrialization, post-industrial philosophy. As you know, since the 60s, you talk about the 60s, 70s time period, when post-industrialization kicked in, the idea was you don't need industry.
I think it's possible that because you have a pro-industrial perspective, it might make you less it might somehow make it less amenable for you to consider things like ecological despoiling and anthropogenic climate change, because they kind of counteract with a pro-industrial worldview.
I don't agree. I don't necessarily think that they are counteract at all. Again, I see the idea that we have, the more you industrialize, the more science and technology grow and evolve, and you actually have an educated population that grows in conjunction with that industrialization process, population growth. But then at the same time, if you notice, the countries that are the most industrial also are the best at limiting their population growth, right? So they're not having 5, 6, 7, 8 children, right? They're looking at the United States, what are we at, around 2, 3 children at an average now? It's like, so the more actually industrial societies to me are in a sense giving us the most advantage that we can have in having real science, real understanding of our impact on the environment. And again, moving towards a holistic dance. This is where I see us moving, a holistic a holistic dance between technology and environment, not the Native American worshiping idea of just going back to nature, living, basically on the land, hunting your own game. I don't think that we have to do that. I don't think we have to go back to that level of nativism to essentially be environmentally friendly. I think that there is a marriage, a harmony of science, technology, and environment. And I think that's what we need to be striving towards.
Okay, so I guess, yeah, I mean, my perspective is more that, yeah, I mean, I look at also like you, I look at it as an evolutionary process. And, we went through a few centuries of industrialization. And I think that's had, both, negative and positive consequences. And as time has gone on, particularly in the last decades, the negative consequences of that are beginning to become more pronounced in certain respects. So for instance, it's not clear that a technological and industrial civilization is actually producing happiness, compared to, let's say, a society like Bhutan, which is considered to have the highest quality of life in the world. And it's the king of Bhutan who actually has suggested that we introduce something called a gross happiness index rather than just a gross domestic product. Because what he's noticed is that people in his society, when they're not kind of infected in a sense by the industrialization, capitalism, consumerism, actually are leading quite fulfilling and happy lives, often living to long lives and living to old healthy ages. Whereas in many societies where people have entered this industrial consumer paradigm, it doesn't seem to very much produce lasting happiness and contentment. And we're seeing higher suicide rates, and in Japan, people basically stopped having sex and so on. I mean, for me, a very interesting thinker in this regard is Helena Norbert Hodge, who runs out of Australia, something called, I think it's called the Institute of Global Localization, something like that. But she was an anthropologist. And when she was in her 20s, in the 1970s, she went to Ladakh to work with the Tibetan Buddhist community there. And she started with a very, sense of, Western superiority, the capitalist culture, modern, European culture was superior. When she lived with that culture there for a while, she actually began to find that a lot of her presumptions were unwound. And she actually realized that they were very happy. They sang together. They worked together in community. If somebody's house burned down, they all selflessly would come together and rebuild the person's house. They didn't have titles. They didn't have land titles or legal structures. They didn't have schools. People learned from their parents, their own home. It wasn't like they, anticipated, having a much different life than their parents did. But there was a very healthy culture that was also a spiritual culture, a sacred culture, a culture of continuity. And then she noticed, as she went back to that region over the next decades, she saw the Indians, got sort of more capitalist and more industrialized, and consumerism moved into that area. And suddenly she found that these same kids who were so happy were like trying to get, new sneakers, sniffing glue, doing drugs, doing heroin, doing speed. They were too embarrassed of their own culture. They wouldn't even sing their traditional songs anymore. They would just want to, listen to, Britney Spears or Madonna or whatever. And she basically, she began to realize that modern industrial culture is like an acid that eats through the kind of DNA of traditional and indigenous cultures, which may actually be the ones that have a lot to teach us. Because if anything, it seems like industrial civilization has entered a kind of death spiral.
Spirituality has always been one of my favorite topics, metaphysics. And I certainly, I can understand, I can relate to this issue very well of how to, basically how do we balance our material life and our material consumption. And when you become a consumer, you also become consumed. So I'm not a fan of what is being passed off as consumer society, the Western world to become a consumer society. I think that we have to be creative. And so for me, it's my happiness comes from creativity. I think most humans can resonate with that. I can't speak for everyone, but I do believe that creativity is what saves the human being and separates the human being from all other animal species and our level of creativity. And I believe we are, made in that image of God, a reflection of the creator or creation itself. So that is what, to me, is what we are striving for. Can we be more creative within our capabilities? And so if we augment our powers and give ourselves the powers within society to have more creativity, then I think we're having a successful society. But if we are not augmenting our ability to create, if we're restricting our ability to create, whether, and it's on all fronts, from culture, the wealth of culture, the wealth of literature, music, visual arts, storytelling, even, exchanging with each other. That to me is the great wealth and ultimate happiness, because happiness is, America's promised the pursuit of happiness, right? Given that we, I think, have overall done pretty well as a nation, and this maybe gets to the question of why I believe in the nation state. I think America is the great example of what a nation state looks like, where the people are sovereign, or at least in document text form. Whether it actually manifests as such, I don't think it has to be proved. But the point is that the people empower their government. The people basically have a government that's responsive to them, and in the process have as much freedom as we enjoy in this, or are supposed to enjoy, at least based on our Bill of Rights. That is the basis by which we can then augment our powers in this world, and our power of creativity, to me, is the root and base of our happiness here.
Yeah, I mean, creativity I agree, creativity is a wonderful thing. In a mass society, an industrial society like the one we've created now, like the US, I mean, I'm happy that you see so many great things in the US. I mean, I see a lot of tremendously depressing things in the US. Like we're seeing a massive mental health crisis, we're seeing massive drug addiction, we're seeing incredible wealth inequality, growing wealth inequality that's separating the middle class and the ultra wealthy. We're seeing a disastrous healthcare system, which is basically, like, I think if you want to get treated for coronavirus in the U.S., it's going to cost you $30,000, whereas most people, I think 40% of the population, have less than $400 savings, and also a lot of the population is in debt. So I think a lot of the freedoms that America, used to offer its people have actually been taken away secretly and surreptitiously over decades. And it's actually a much different situation now than we're pretending it is. And that for me is also what's powering the frustration of people that to me leads to abhorrent expressions like Trumpism and Q-anon, which to me are expressions of a very, very frustrated, very, very angry mentality of people who feel that their future is being taken away from them and are looking to lash out. So I'd be curious to hear a little bit about your perspective on Trump and the deep state now. Sure.
I mean, it's a long conversation. Trump and Trumpism to me reflects the traditional American perspective of pro-industry, pro-nation state, pro-national sovereignty, not being, the first things that he was interested in were getting out of the Paris Accords, getting out of the, the international partnership with Asia. I can't remember which one it was, one of those, treaties, basically moving us into a more energy sovereignty, when it comes to drilling, being an exporter of oil as opposed to an importer.
Well, hold on a second. That had already happened under Obama, right? I mean, we became the world's #1 oil producer, which I totally think is terrible, ironically. But Obama was responsible for that. He credited himself, and Hillary Clinton also credited herself as helping the U.S. become the world's biggest oil producer again.
In that case, yeah, but expanding it with the Keystone XL pipeline project. And overall, remember,
despite the destruction that's doing to the environment and so on.
Again, remember, we're going to use that. We're going to need energy regardless. And until we shift to higher forms of power production, I'm personally a fan of nuclear thorium in particular. But that's another conversation. But the point is that you have to generate energy and power. We can't pretend that we're going to go back to a society that lives, with less energy consumption and production. So we have to basically live within the parameters of where we are and evolve, to higher forms of energy production hereafter. So when I was thinking about Trump as a nationalist, I don't think that is offensive to me, although some people on the left seem to think that's an offensive concept. But actually, that was the traditional American outlook and orientation until, you could say really, could say the Bush years in particular, Bush Senior, Clinton, Bush Junior, Obama. It became more of this idea, what you could call a New World Order agenda. But the New World Order agenda is, again, more about globalization and multipolarity and taking America out of its place. Not just, I don't think America has to lead the world, but I think America has to have sovereignty over itself and responsiveness to its own people within the context of a nation state that, again, is unique in modern history. And so I think Trump was very much a populist in that regard. And probably the most responsive president to the people that I've ever seen. And so I guess those are the basis of my support for him. And then, particularly this past year not just this past year, overall with the media's vitriol to me.
You ever see them sign?
A lot of the media creating a lot of this anger and condemnation. I've never seen the media treat any president this way in my entire lifetime, which, knowing the media as I do and how manipulative it is and how controlled the narrative is, he had to be doing some things right. So I supported him on that basis. But overall, Trumpism, I think, is reflective of nationalism that many Americans, most working class, you talk about, people feeling disenfranchised, disempowered. Guess what? He actually grew the bottom 30% of the economy, believe it or not. He brought, joblessness down to its lowest level. It's not in recent history. I know in recent history, if not throughout time, but he really seems to have been an engine driving a return to this sort of, make it in America, buy American ethos that, again, is an industrial factor or faction. And
I mean,
on that. So
my understanding, and I'm now going to admit, as I will when I'm fuzzy on the details, is that a lot of that was smoke and mirrors. I mean, one thing that Trump did is borrow a fuck ton of money, right? Like, Republicans always say that they care about, the national debt. Then they end up being the ones who, totally expand it massively. I don't really remember the critique of this sort of economic miracle that was happening with Trump in the first few years. But I do feel my memory of it is that it was a very artificially inflated situation. The one thing where I do have some sympathy with Trump, and as I said, I'm not, as you are, a nationalist. I mean, I think, nationalism is another kind of prejudice system. Lester, we can't have
that to America. That to America.
Wow.
Okay, are you still able to speak? Unmute you. Let's see.
I'm sorry, I thought it was muted. I didn't mean to yawn.
These things have happened to me before on Zoom, and sometimes you have to just give up at a certain point.
Just throw peanuts.
What's that?
Throw peanuts at the peanut gallery. Tell them to shut up.
They can throw peanuts at us. So I don't know. I mean, I question the economic miracle, but I do kind of agree that I do think it was kind of good that Trump was making some, at least, gestures around China's increasing power. And my understanding is that's one of the main reasons that they pulled out of the Paris Accord, is because China had been given a very kind of unfair largesse, where China didn't really have to make any changes for quite a long time, whereas all these other countries then had to reduce their but from my perspective, which is not your perspective, even the Paris Accord is kind of a joke, because the amount of reduction that they were asking for was so much less than what the true environmental scientists say is necessary, and it was only voluntary. The compliance was only voluntary, so it has no teeth in it. So it was a joke it was kind of a joke from the start. I personally am kind of terrified I'll even go further than that, by the way. I would say my perspective that the environmental crisis is going to lead in the next decades to civilizational collapse and potentially human extinction, because we're just it's a nice idea that northern climates are going to become more food productive, but the amount of rapid transformation that's going to happen as the southern climates become relatively uninhabitable. I mean, even just this summer, I know so many people who migrated out of out of California after these fires. That's going to be happening turbocharged all around the world until there's no place left to migrate to. So yeah, I mean the fact that Trump and his people totally disregarded the ecological situation to me was tragic.
That's true, America, you fucking left-wing piece of shit.
You're muted, Daniel. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. I had my.
I removed that person. Oh. No, I've lost control of this thing. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're fine. Was that a terrorist on the line?
I've had these attacks before on this platform. It's quite interesting, actually. Anyway. So, and what about QAnon? What was your perspective on QAnon? Uh-oh. You're muted again, sorry.
I thought it was interesting to have this sort of dissemination on a board or in a public chat forum, of questions that got people engaged and, looking at things, questioning. I did buzzsaws, before Gaia since 2013, and many interviews. We talked on many issues from the spiritual to the esoteric, the occult, the alien, conspiratorial, everything. And I felt like this was a way of making it more mainstream, starting to take these issues that you could say are conspiracy, but I look at as reality. I think reality is very conspiratorial, when you have the kind of money and power and influence of, the people even above the Bill Gates of the world, so to actually bring that to the public and actually have the public start to become citizen journalists and start to, bring their own perspective and disseminate the information between each other. I have no problem with that. I didn't see it as a cult so much as, just an information or disinformation platform. As, I think the media is the same thing. I think the media has got more power than Q. And
you're being such a pathetic bitch. You play Nixon, you fucking nigger loving bitch. You should go kill yourself right now on Zoom.
Wow. Okay. I didn't play Nixon, by the way. I played his little brother in the movie. So the point is that to me, Q is just, you can't call Q a cult and without calling CNN a cult. There's there's nothing that, was cult-like about Q as far as, dropping their information or disinformation, however you want to interpret it, and letting people engage with it as they wish. In fact, it's probably less cult-like than CNN because at least it encouraged people to engage and to discuss and share information, whereas CNN and others want you to be pacified. They don't even want you to really, engage. They just want you to sit back and just perceive the world the way they tell you to perceive it.
I find that interesting, and I can understand some of that perspective. I do think that QAnon was an expression of people's frustration and despair, and their feeling that they're kept out of the structure of power, that things are happening that are totally opaque to them. My perspective is that that generalized feeling of frustration was then somehow channeled into a particular narrative that is a little bit demented and a little bit worrisome, in that it then leads to things like the storming of the Capitol, where there were people who were QAnon believers who seemed ready to even kidnap or assassinate members of Congress and so on. And it had this, some of the QAnon kind of ideology verges on stuff that we saw in the 1920s and 30s that culminated in things that happened with the Nazis and fascism, like kind of the rehabilitation of the protocols of Zion, a kind of very intense anti-Semitism. And we saw in that QAnon group people wearing these shirts that said 6MWE, 6 million wasn't enough, or shirts with Auschwitz. And of course, there's a broad spectrum of people that may not represent, most of them or even the mainstream. But it does seem concerning that some of what was getting stirred up, was very irrational, and including this idea that members of the sort of neoliberal establishment, who I personally do not like at all. Like I think Obama and the Clintons were disasters on many levels, but I don't think that they are sucking adrenochrome from the brains of babies. And it concerns me that so many people now have a literal belief that that's what was happening.
By the way, that's a Stephen King book. It's called Sleeping Beauties. It's a book that.
Go ahead, can you talk?
Yeah. Oh, was that? I didn't know if you were still talking.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm done.
Okay. Well, you shouldn't have watched Buzzsaw in that case. Buzzsaw had even had plenty of that and more. In fact, when it comes to the multidimensionality of our universe, I'll tell you one thing: there are stranger things here than meet the eye. I've personally seen things that are from beyond this dimension. I know people that have been, let's say, invited to some of these rituals and parties. Not to say that they saw human sacrifice, but at that level of power, you have to understand there's an ability to get away with anything. And I mean, we have sort of different worldviews, so it's a difficult thing to get into, within one conversation. I feel like there's a lot we have to unwrap here. But if from my introduction to understanding satanic conspiracy within the power structure it's not about Democrat or Republican. I read a book called The Franklin Cover-Up, which was then done. The Franklin Scandal was an evolution of it. You may have heard about in Nebraska, and it was basically a child trafficking ring that was involving one of the heads of the Republican National Committees at that time. And there was Satanism involved, sacrifice, trafficking of kids. I mean, you name it, just horrible things. And the guy that wrote that book, The Franklin Cover-Up, was actually a former Special Forces Vietnam veteran named John DeCamp, who was a representative of his state senator. And he was just so appalled by what he was seeing.
What year was that?
This was he wrote this book in the 90s. And he was close to William Colby, former CIA director, who died suddenly in the 90s. Some people think he was killed. There's indication that could have been the case, but he was close to Colby, and he kind of asked Colby about it, when he was investigating, and Colby said, just stay away from that stuff because it's real. These things are real. We know, human trafficking is a huge, huge issue. And if you think that it just occurs with millions of people across this planet every year without those in power being involved or connected or protecting it, you're mistaken. These power structures operate, they're interlocking the same way the drug traffic interlocks with the intelligence community and the mafias. That oligarchy, you referenced earlier, is very intertwined, and the higher it goes, it's connected, but at the same time, there are different factions, no doubt. Not everybody just gets along. I think that, you could say that the party structure, Republican, Democrat.
So let's say, Sean, that I wanted to establish for myself the legitimacy or illegitimacy of this satanic, narrative that, because I've tried, and I've asked people who are my friends who are deep into QAnon, send me your best resources. What do I need to read? What do I need to watch? And I didn't really find anything very convincing. The most convincing thing that I heard was one friend of mine who's a very unique and eccentric person, told me that she had a friend who I've met who's a master healer in a kind of esoteric discipline, was working with Hillary Clinton, and that she had a disease that only cannibals get, Kuru or something like that. That was the one thing that I heard that seemed in any form of corroboration, but that was like third hand. And I mean, you know, I've met Mariana Abramovich. You know, I do not think that she's a practicing Satanist. You know, I don't think that the emails from Podesta and Clinton.
Let me just add one thing though, in terms of Abramovich. So it depends on how you define Satanism, because, you know, if you think about it, Crowley, Aleister Crowley was not a Satanist. He was, you know, head of Oro Templis Orientis, and his Thelema practice was about willpower. You see, if you really understand what Satanism is about, individual will, my will be done, not thy will, not God's will, not a trust and a faith in a creator or higher power, but ultimately the worship of the individual ego and will. A lot of her art is very much connected to this idea of will and the overcoming of, you know, basically self-inflicting pain. I think one of her first rituals that she did as art was creating a pentagram and then like cutting herself and putting blood into the pentagram. These are rituals. These are ancient rituals. Christians oftentimes convolute it and call it all Satanism, right? But essentially these are ancient practices and experimentations of willpower. So what she does is certainly veers to my sensitivity, my intuition on the dark side. That's why she does these spirit cooking ceremonies. Now you can say, oh, it's all fun and games to have a body. Have you ever seen this, the spirit cooking, where they, for example, they literally have had parties where they have bodies that look like a human being, and it's a cake and you cut it and you eat it. It's a cannibalistic ritual, you see, and it's done for fun. Well, is it like the Bohemian Grove where they sacrifice a child in effigy, burn a child, but it's not a child, it's an effigy. Symbolism. This is the level of how, having studied magic and many of these practices for a long time, symbolism is very much tied to the occult, because energetically, where you give your intention and where you actually are being drawn, even at the level of film or media, it's actually merging you in a multidimensional level to that frequency. Whether that's low vibe or high vibe, you see, it's ultimately up to you in terms of your...
Fuck you, Sean. Fucking faggot, kill yourself.
So my fans are obviously coming out. But I'm speaking to this, that those understand everything in this universe is intention, which is to say the energy and the frequency behind that which you speak, you feel, you intuit, right? And you do. But there's an energy that couples it. And this is the realm where I talk about multidimensionality of this universe, that many of the occult practices are right in our faces, right? But it's done in such a way that, oh, it's symbolic, oh, it's artistic, oh, it doesn't mean anything. But actually everything means something.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I do find that compelling and interesting. I mean, yeah, I mean, art, you know, as I wrote about in Breaking Open the Head, you know, when the modern world divested itself of magic and shamanism, you know, the artist kind of took that role, you know, so of course, you know, the artist draws upon those energy sources and those symbolisms. You know, I don't know if I necessarily think that makes Abramovich a practitioner of anything dark. I think that she's a creative explorer of, you know, edge realms, which is kind of what, you know, we expect artists to do. I mean, Chris Burden in the 60s had himself crucified to a car, had himself shot. You know, I mean, you know, art, you know, the artist's life and the art production is often a kind of ritual theater that verges on magic. So that in itself doesn't seem to me to lend any credence to this idea that Abramovich is somehow involved with a kind of satanic cabal or, you know, however you want to say it, a cult cabal of neoliberals because they like their art. But and I understand what you're saying, that there may be a consciousness level and levels that are unconscious. You know, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, and in terms of the, you know, so that's, you know, for me, I'm curious to find more proof one way or the other.
place to go. Franklin cover-up and Franklin scandal is a good place to go if you want to see something that was a working satanic network that did connect to people within the political process. And then, you know, obviously that's just the rabbit hole if you want to go further into. I did a lot of this research years before the internet, before YouTube blew up a lot of the understandings about the satanic ritual abuse and the Illuminati stuff. I mean, I was doing this stuff just reading. And then over time, you start to realize that a lot of these things have been depicted symbolically. But again, where you say, what you don't understand is, I guess what you do understand this, but energetically, why is someone putting their frequency into such a state of negation of life, of perversion? You see, there is everything to do with our channels and our being clear. I'm talking about Abramovich, for example, right? And depicting her art with this lust for blood. And it's almost like saying, well, you know, yes, I know what you're saying.
But Sean, it just feels like the whole
killer, right?
The whole culture is saturated. I mean, you turn on Netflix, there's a million shows that are
it's very dark
films and so on. I mean, she's just an artist. Artists explore edge realms, you know, of perception and consciousness, and
it reflects their own
zones. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're practicing like a, you know, a dark art. You know.
Okay, I'll give you one other thing I learned. Within the lodges, the reason why Masonry and other secret societies have existed for so long is partly, you could say partly it's like a good old boy network or networks and clubs. But actually, if you understand the energetics, when you do ritual, there are beings that are unseen. There are entities that are unseen that are feeding on that. And this is something that I've come to understanding through, again, understanding of ancient mysticism to the place of today, where we can, as I've seen it from some of these, what are those, Carillion photography, you can basically see entity attachments on people. There are entities that feed through us on energies. And so low vibration energies of ritual sacrifice or even symbolic sacrifice or symbolic deeds feeds these entities. Fear is a tremendous factor in it. So, you know, whether or not the adrenochrome is feeding reptilian aliens or whatnot, I can't tell you for sure. That's certainly what I heard years ago.
Sean, what about on the other side? I mean, for instance, Netflix had that show about this kind of evangelical political movements, and sort of, you know, if you look at kind of the evangelical wing of Christianity, which has been solidly behind people like Trump, I mean, to me, that feels like a completely archonic, you know, kind of a kind of religious form that's possessed by a negative archon. You know,
I'm not saying that every Christian is a Christian and not every Muslim is a Muslim, not every Jew is a Jew, right? There are definitely, again, there are definitely entities that use power, worldly. I always say, look at this, worldly power. If someone is feeding on worldly power, be careful of that person, right? Because the true Christian knows that their kingdom is not of this world, right? That they basically, we're born of, you know, we're made of what, of a semen, and we end up as dust, right? So this is not our world. We're here to hopefully to evolve our character and our being, right, through this journey, through this incarnation. That's what I see it as, the evolution of the being and becoming a better person. But ultimately, if a Christian's telling you it's all about this world and give me more money and more power here, then they're not truly Christian.
Yeah. You know, we've been talking for an hour and 15 minutes, and I think maybe it's a nice place to end for today. I think it's interesting. I mean, I feel like there are areas where you and I have some very deep similarities, but I also see a multidimensional reality. I also believe there are occult forces that are working through this world. I just have a very different interpretation of, you know, other facets of it. You know, I mean, and it would be interesting to keep drilling down and you know, see if, you know, if either of us budge, you know, given some time and opportunity, you know.
Sure. No, I appreciate the conversation and dialogue. You know, because we come from different orientations around these things. And, you know, it's difficult to say like budge, because ultimately, you know, you're an intellectual and you have your lineage of what you've studied and learned, right? I likewise have my lineage of the things that I've studied and learned. And so there's no way of I think that's the beauty of this society, though. That's the beauty of our reality, is that we're here to have these conversations, to have the debates, that we don't have to agree, that we don't have to ultimately say, you know, it's this or that we be able to share these thoughts and hopefully influence each other in the way we perceive the world. But I love the fact that we don't agree, because if we did, then we'd really be worried. And that's my greatest fear, is the 1984 reality, is the Orwellian thought control, is the policing of thoughts, the policing of ideas. That's what scares me more than anything.
Well, I guess my perspective is, I mean, on the one hand, you know, I have a great deal of concern about this sort of ecological, you know, scenario that seems to be inevitable to some extent. But then on the other hand, I have, and you know, maybe you share this, when you look at China and you see the social control structure and the use of technology as a tool of just, you know, really inhibiting human expression. And I mean, you know, I'm pretty convinced that the virus was engineered in Wuhan, and the Chinese, you know, if you look, I mean, I wrote in this little book, Conspiranoia, how the Chinese have been like focused on biowarfare as the future theater of war, and they're looking at nanobots that they can put in people's brains that would actually stop them on a you know, sort of neurological level from being able to resist or fight against a protest. So, you know, I'm very concerned that the whole world could lurch in that direction. I mean, I'm very interested in, like, you know, I don't agree with everything that RFK Jr. does, but he had a very interesting interview with Catherine Austin Fitts, a former economist, who believes that, you know, the central bankers have realized that the economic system has to be sort of toast, you know, that it has to be changed systemically. And the idea is ultimately to use some form of crypto to create like a global cashless society. And, you know, you probably also agree that that's a very sneaky control, you know, methodology. So I do think that we may be in a, you know, sort of small period where we have to make choices, and we do have to get people on the same page about what's coming, and how you know, collectively, you know, people can respond to it.
Yes.
So I do think there are some areas, even if there are some areas of disagreement, you know, drilling down to those other areas of common ground would be valuable.
Absolutely. In fact, I was reading your Conspiranoia, and when it comes to Bill Gates, have you read the oneness versus 1%? Oneness versus the 1%?
Vandana Shiva is somebody who I absolutely love. I mean, I definitely vibrate with her perspective a lot, resonate a lot with her. What about you?
Excellent. Yeah. That's no, I didn't see it referenced in the book. I mean, maybe I didn't read it close enough, but
no, I've been reading it since, actually. I hadn't read it when I wrote that book.
Perfect. Yeah, I thought she does an excellent job, and precisely, look, we are, no matter what, you know, I'm not like they say, I like Elizabeth April, who's one of the channels that I tend to, you know, resonate with her a little bit, you know, as a channel, and there's others that I resonate with. She talks about how, look, we don't want Biden or Trump ultimately as our leader. What we're moving towards is a tremendous awareness of the oneness of humanity. But I believe in the process, polarization is an essential quality, just like in alchemy. There is a necessary polarization. There is a rejuvenation that takes place in that process, because then you realize, well, if I'm conflicting with you, where can we find the common ground, right? If once we recognize where we disagree, what are the commonalities? And that is where we come to this oneness, which again is not a totalitarian imposed oneness, but a shared resonance of humanity, of emotion and feeling and being fundamentally human. So I see the renaissance of humanity coming. I think that, I agree with you. There are environmental things.
Oops. He seems to have frozen. Give another minute. Let's see. Drats, that was turning out to be a great little moment to end on. Well, maybe I will just end there. And thanks everybody for joining us today. It was fascinating to have those sort of diabolical interventions from outside. But I guess that's part of the show right now. Okay, thanks everybody, and we'll do this again soon. And I think it was quite an interesting conversation. Thank you.